These are questions that thinkers have been wrestling with for centuries. Like, what is real? How do our minds connect with the world around us? And Ibn Taymiyyah, he brings this really insightful Islamic perspective to these questions.
Let's start with the basics. This whole debate between materialism and idealism,
Right.
I think I kind of have an idea what those mean, but can you break it down for us?
Sure. So think of it this way. Materialism basically says that the physical world,
Okay.
the stuff we can see and touch, that's the fundamental reality.
Yeah.
Our minds, our thoughts, everything comes from that physical stuff. Idealism, on the other hand, flips it. It says that the mind or ideas
Right.
are the central things, and they shape how we see reality.
So one says the physical world is primary and the other says that the mind is primary.
Exactly.
That's a big difference.
It's a huge difference, yeah.
So where does Ibn Taymiyyah fit into all of this?
He falls squarely in the materialist camp. He believed that the physical world exists,
Right.
whether we're thinking about it or not, and that our knowledge comes from interacting with that physical world.
Like the scholar Ahmad ibn Hanbal, they thought the human brain, when we're born, it's like a blank slate.
Right.
No preloaded ideas or anything, just this potential to learn. Is that something that modern science supports?
It's interesting. On that point, Ibn Taymiyyah is really aligned with modern neuroscience.
Really?
Yeah. We know that the brain is incredibly adaptable, constantly rewiring itself based on our experiences.
That's amazing. So we start with this blank slate.
Yeah.
How did he think we actually acquire knowledge then?
So he laid out a pretty clear process, and it all begins with our senses.
Okay.
We take in information about the world through our senses, sights, sounds, smells,
Yeah,
all of that sensory input.
the whole experience.
Exactly.
Yeah,
But it doesn't stop there.
right.
Our brains then take all of those sensory inputs
Right.
and abstract them into concepts
In
and
language. You're saying the words we use are that important how we understand things.
Absolutely. Language is not just about expressing ourselves. It's the tool we use to share what we know with other people
Okay.
and to build on knowledge that's already been gathered. Think about it. You can learn about things you've never personally experienced because someone else observed it, documented it, and shared that knowledge through language.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it that way. It's kind of like the scientific method. Like new discoveries, they build on what came before.
You got it. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, there wasn't a rigid separation between different kinds of knowledge, like, necessary knowledge versus theoretical knowledge.
Right.
He saw it as all relative, changing based on a person's understanding and experiences.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Think about the idea that the Earth is round. Seems obvious now, right? But it wasn't always.
Right, of course.
It took tons of observations, experiments, and building on existing knowledge to get to that understanding.
Right.
So what might have once been considered theoretical knowledge based on limited understanding eventually became accepted as necessary knowledge through repeated experience and observation.
So even those seemingly basic facts weren't always so clear-cut.
Yeah. What we know really depends on what we've experienced and what we've been able to verify.
Okay, so we build knowledge through our senses.
Right.
We use language to understand it, and even incomplete knowledge is valuable. I can see how that works for understanding, the physical world. But what about concepts like God? How did Ibn Taymiyyah approach something like that?
Now that's where it gets really interesting. Ibn Taymiyyah, he applied this materialist lens to religious concepts as well. He argued that even our understanding of God comes from our experiences in the world, specifically the experiences of prophets
Okay.
through divine revelation.
So even though we haven't directly experienced those things ourselves, we can still learn about them through these accounts of how the prophets interacted with the divine.
Exactly. And Ibn Taymiyyah recognized that we might not fully grasp the how of God's attributes.
Yeah, the how is hard.
But he argued that our understanding of their meaning is still valid.
Okay.
And we base that understanding on how similar concepts work in human language and experience, recognizing that God's attributes are like the ultimate perfect form of those concepts.
So it sounds like even though Ibn Taymiyyah really emphasized sensory experience, he still valued the role of reason in understanding things.
Oh, absolutely. He saw reason as building upon our sensory data. It helps us analyze information, connect the dots, and understand cause and effect.
It's not about getting rid of reason, it's about grounding it
Exactly.
in those real-world experiences.
Exactly.
If he was so into materialism, what did he think of the idealists?
Well, he definitely had some critiques for both subjective and objective idealism.
What were they?
He felt that subjective idealism underestimated our capacity for objective knowledge.
Okay.
And with objective idealism, he thought it kind of put the cart before the horse
What do you mean?
by treating abstract concepts as the primary reality,
Oh, I see.
rather than seeing them as coming from our interactions with the physical world.
So he really had some strong opinions on this.
He did.
It's fascinating to see how this whole way of thinking, this materialist view, it shapes his perspective even on religious matters. But sometimes these big philosophical ideas, they can feel kind of abstract.
I know what you mean.
Did his philosophy actually have practical implications, for how we live and understand the world?
It absolutely does. One of the most important implications comes from his concept of quantitative changes leading to qualitative changes.
I'm not sure I follow.
Okay, so he believed that small, gradual changes can eventually cause huge shifts in something's nature.
Can you give us a concrete example?
Sure. Imagine you're building a sandcastle, right?
Yeah.
Grain by grain.
Yeah.
Each grain is a small change, but eventually adding just one more grain causes the whole thing to collapse.
Oh, I see.
That's a quantitative change, the number of grains,
Yeah.
leading to a qualitative change, the structure of the castle.
Okay, so how did Ibn Taymiyyah connect this to, social groups or politics?
He argued that this principle is essential for understanding how societies change and how groups function. He believed that small changes within a society, individual actions, shifting beliefs, or behaviors that can build up and actually transform the society's very nature.
So it's not just about revolutions or these big dramatic events?
Not necessarily, no.
Even everyday actions and choices can contribute to social and political change.
Exactly. It's a constant process, this buildup of seemingly small actions that can reach a tipping point and create significant shifts.
This is super relevant. Makes you think about the impact our individual actions can have.
It does.
Even small things.
Right. It highlights that understanding those underlying dynamics, those small changes that drive big shifts, is crucial for navigating our world.
And it brings us back to that one of Ibn Taymiyyah's key ideas. Even partial knowledge.
Yeah.
Those little bits of understanding, they can be incredibly valuable.
Right, because they all contribute to this bigger collective understanding that can actually drive real change.
So it's not just about having all the answers. It's about contributing what we know, even if it's just a small piece.
Exactly. It's all part of a bigger picture.
This has been incredible. I feel like we're just scratching the surface of Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas, though.
There's so much more to explore.
But this gives us a good starting point.
Definitely a solid foundation.
Before we go, I want to leave our listener with a final thought.
Okay.
You know how Ibn Taymiyyah said that even partial knowledge is valuable? It reflects a part of reality. How do you think that challenges how we usually think about learning and being an expert? Does it make you rethink the things you think you know for sure?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It really goes to the heart of Ibn Taymiyyah's emphasis on humility and the idea that learning is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
It reminds us that even the most knowledgeable people have limits to what they know. And our understanding is always evolving.
So it's not about pretending to have all the answers.
No, not at all.
It's about recognizing that we're all learning and discovering together.
Absolutely.
That's a really powerful thought, and maybe even a little humbling.
It is, isn't it? It really is. It makes you realize that even when we think we've got something figured out, there's always more to learn.
It's amazing how Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas about knowledge and change,
Yeah.
they connect to his political views, too. He wasn't just some philosopher in an ivory tower.
Right.
He was really engaged with the world around him.
He was. Absolutely.
So how did this idea of small changes leading to big shifts play into his political thought?
It's a key part of understanding his perspective. Ibn Taymiyyah believed that a ruler's legitimacy wasn't just about some, inherent right to rule.
Okay.
He emphasized justice and the well-being of the people.
So a ruler couldn't just claim authority.
Right.
They had to actually govern fairly and take care of their people.
Exactly. He believed that if a ruler failed to uphold justice or didn't ensure the welfare of the people, those failures, those individual acts of injustice or neglect, they could build up over time and actually lead to a loss of legitimacy.
Right.
It could even lead to the overthrow of that ruler or government.
That's a pretty radical idea for his time, isn't it?
It was. It challenged the whole notion of absolute authority
Yeah.
and really put the focus on the responsibility of rulers to the people.
To the governed.
Yes, exactly.
And it also highlights the power of the people.
Right.
Ibn Taymiyyah recognized that even individuals without official power could contribute to social and political change.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about these big revolutions or uprisings.
Not necessarily.
Even small acts of resistance or pushing back against injustice, they can make a difference.
Exactly. It's this reminder that change often happens gradually.
Yeah.
This buildup of seemingly small actions that can eventually reach a tipping point, like that sandcastle analogy.
That makes me think about how we participate in social or political movements today. It's not always about those grand gestures.
Right.
It's about consistent effort.
Yeah.
The individual actions that add up to create change.
And that ties back to one of the core ideas we've been discussing. Even partial knowledge, those small bits of understanding are incredibly valuable.
They contribute to that larger collective understanding.
Right. He was really critical of what he saw as blindly following tradition or authority.
Oh, interesting.
Without questioning things. He believed it was essential to engage with ideas.
Even old ideas.
Even old, established ones. With a critical mind.
So it's not about just accepting what's been passed down. It's about questioning those ideas.
Yeah.
Analyzing them.
Yeah.
Making sure they still hold up.
Exactly.
Under scrutiny.
Yeah. He believed that real knowledge comes from that process of actively engaging with those ideas.
Okay.
Using reason and evidence to test them and refine our understanding.
Yeah.
And he saw that process as essential for intellectual and spiritual growth.
That's a really powerful message. It challenges us to be active learners.
Right.
Not just passively absorbing information.
Yeah. We have a responsibility to engage with ideas critically and to form our own understanding.
And that process of thinking critically, questioning, seeking understanding, that resonates across cultures and throughout history.
It does. It's at the heart of intellectual inquiry.
Yeah.
And it's a key part of being a lifelong learner.
It really makes you think about how we approach learning and knowledge in our own lives.
Right.
Are we willing to challenge our own assumptions? To be open to new ideas even when they're uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Or do we stick with what's familiar and easy?
Those are important questions to ask ourselves. And it's worth remembering that for Ibn Taymiyyah, learning and seeking knowledge, that was a journey, not a destination. There's always more to discover and understand.
It's like that saying, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Exactly.
It's an endless adventure, this pursuit of knowledge.
It really is embracing that curiosity,
Yeah.
that willingness to keep exploring and questioning.
Yeah.
That's what keeps us engaged
Right.
and helps us grow
Helps us see the world in new ways.
and uncover new insights, even in places we thought we knew.
And I think what's so interesting about Ibn Taymiyyah is that he was really a master of Islamic law. He really knew his stuff when it came to that.
Yeah, a legal scholar.
Right. But he was also this incredible deep thinker, delving into philosophy and theology.
Yeah, and that combination, I think, is really what makes him so unique.
Absolutely. I mean, you wouldn't believe the debates and discussions he sparked back then and that continue today.
I mean, centuries later, still talking about him.
Exactly.
And that's where we're doing a deep dive. This isn't just some dusty academic figure that nobody cares about anymore. So our mission today, I guess, is to really unpack, what made him so controversial. How did he arrive at his conclusions? And, we'll really be focusing on his epistemology.
Yeah.
Like, how did he think we gain knowledge?
Right.
Especially about God and his ontology. Like, what did he actually believe about the nature of reality, particularly when it comes to God?
And I think to really grasp his impact, we need to understand the context. Back then, a lot of Islamic scholars were grappling with trying to reconcile faith and reason.
Yeah.
Particularly because of the influence of Greek philosophy. I mean, some scholars like Al-Farabi even suggested that you could interpret scripture allegorically. Well, if it seemed to clash with reason.
Yeah.
But Ibn Taymiyyah, he wasn't really on board with that approach.
Yeah, so he wasn't totally against reason, it sounds like.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, he definitely saw the value in reason.
Okay.
But he was very cautious about elevating it above revelation.
Especially when it came to God.
Especially when it came to trying to understand God.
Okay, so that kind of sets the stage then for, how he viewed other schools of thought that were, really emphasizing reason.
Yeah, and that's where his critiques come in. I mean, he was known for being a pretty sharp critic.
Okay.
Engaging with some really big names and schools of thought.
Yeah.
For example, he took on the philosophers and their whole concept of an eternal, complete cause for the universe.
Okay.
He argued that if this cause is already complete and perfect, right,
Mm-hmm.
then how do you explain the constant change and all the new things emerging in the world?
Like, where's the dynamism?
Exactly. It's like the recipe is finished, but how do you account for the actual baking process?
I love that analogy, yeah. It's like you have a recipe for a cake, but that doesn't explain the whole experience of actually baking it.
Right. The smells, the transformations, the taste even.
Yeah, you're missing a crucial part of the story.
Exactly. And his critiques didn't stop there. I mean, he also challenged the Kalam theologians, particularly their take on God's will.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So he felt that they were creating this kind of artificial separation between God's will and his actions, leading to this idea of a God who sort of set things in motion
Okay.
and then just stepped back.
Like a clockmaker.
Exactly. And Ibn Taymiyyah was adamant that God is not just this distant clockmaker. He's perpetually active, constantly creating, engaging with the world.
So he's not hands-off. He's like hands-on involved.
Absolutely involved in every moment and every event.
Wow. Okay. So that's a very different conception of God than maybe some people were used to at the time.
Definitely. And you see this really active God idea in his critique of the Mutazilites as well.
Who were they?
They were a school of thought that really emphasized free will and human agency.
Okay.
But Ibn Taymiyyah believed that God actually creates our actions just as he creates everything else in the universe.
Wait a minute. So are you saying we don't have free will?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. I mean, he uses this really interesting analogy to explain his view.
Okay, I'm listening.
Imagine a doctor prescribing medicine to a patient. The doctor commands the action of taking the medicine, but doesn't actually force the patient to take it, right?
Right.
The patient still chooses whether to follow the doctor's orders.
So it's like God's the doctor who prescribes or commands good actions, but ultimately it's up to us to decide if we're actually going to follow through.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so free will is still there.
Yeah.
But the ability to make those choices in the first place, that comes from God.
Right. It's a subtle but really important distinction.
Very interesting.
And it brings us to one of the most fascinating parts of Ibn Taymiyyah's thought, his epistemology.
Oh, we know things. Right.
Right? How we know things, particularly how we gain knowledge about God.
Okay.
And he believed that we do this through both reason and revelation.
So not just blindly following scripture, but also not just getting lost in philosophical arguments.
Exactly. It's about using both reason and revelation in this kind of harmonious way.
To come to a deeper understanding of God.
Right, and this is where his concept of theological jurisprudence comes in.
Okay, what's that all about?
He actually believed that speaking correctly about God is a form of worship.
Wow, so language really matters here.
Absolutely. It's about choosing your words carefully, making sure that your understanding aligns with what's been revealed through Scripture.
And he believed that reason and revelation work together to guide us in that process.
Right. We have to use both to really understand what God is trying to tell us.
Okay, so can you unpack this whole theological jurisprudence idea a little bit more?
Sure. So he believed that God's attributes are revealed to us through the Quran and the Hadith, right?
Okay.
And the nuances of the Arabic language help us really understand their true meaning.
So every word, every phrase carries weight.
Exactly. It's like every word in the Quran is a piece of a giant puzzle.
We need all those pieces to see the full picture.
Beautiful analogy, but while he definitely valued reason and language, he wasn't a fan of the overly complicated cosmological arguments that some theologians use to prove God's existence.
Yeah, like those abstract theoretical proofs that some people came up with.
Right, he found them kind of unnecessarily convoluted.
So he's not trying to fit God into this neat philosophical box.
Exactly. He's more focused on the world around us, the complexity, the beauty, the sheer improbability of it all.
And saying, hey, this points to a creator, right?
Exactly. He favored more straightforward proofs rooted in observation and our innate understanding of creation.
So instead of getting lost in abstract theories, he's saying, just look around you. The evidence for God is everywhere.
Right. And I think that's a really powerful idea.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so we've covered his critiques of the philosophers, the theologians, even those who really emphasized free will.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like he's really challenging the status quo,
Mm-hmm.
Pushing back against some pretty established ideas.
Definitely he was a bold thinker.
And he's doing it all while saying, hey, we need reason, we need revelation to understand God.
Right. It's not an either situation, it's both hand.
But where does his own understanding of God fit into all of this?
That's a fantastic question, and it leads us right into his ontology, his beliefs about the nature of reality, and of course the nature of God.
Okay, this is where things start to get really interesting.
Absolutely.
Tell me more about this dynamic God. What makes his view so unique?
Well, for one thing, he rejects this whole idea of God as static and unchanging.
Okay.
He believes that God is perpetually active, constantly creating, engaging with the world.
So he's always working, always doing something.
Right. His will is eternal, not in the sense of being frozen in time.
But in the sense of being in motion.
Exactly. Constantly in motion, perpetually bringing things into being.
So he's really challenging this traditional view of eternity as timelessness.
Yeah, for him, God isn't outside of time. He's actively shaping and influencing every single moment of it.
Wow. Okay, so that raises a lot of questions about God's attributes then.
Absolutely.
Constantly creating and engaging with the world.
Right. And now some of you might be thinking, okay, if God is so active and involved, why is there so much suffering,
Right. If he's all powerful and all good, why does evil exist in the first place?
It's a question that's been around for a long time.
Yeah, the age-old problem of evil, right?
Exactly. And it definitely comes up when you're talking about a God who's not just some distant, uninvolved being, but actively participating in creation.
So how did Ibn Taymiyyah approach this whole problem of evil?
Well, what's interesting is that he didn't shy away from it.
He didn't try to pretend it wasn't there?
No, he acknowledged that evil is a real thing in the world.
So he's not sugarcoating things or trying to explain it away as some kind of illusion.
Right. He's facing it head on.
So how does he square that with his belief in a perpetually active and good God?
Well, he does it by drawing some really interesting distinctions.
Okay.
Like what? For example, he differentiates between God's acts that are directed towards creation and those that are directed towards religious obligation or law.
So you're saying there's a difference between how God acts when he's creating the world and the commands he gives us for how to live.
Right, there's a distinction there.
Okay, help me understand that a bit more.
Okay, so God might will something in creation that seems to contradict his commands, but for a higher purpose.
Okay.
A purpose that ultimately reflects his wisdom, even if we don't fully grasp it.
So it's kind of like that doctor analogy we talked about before.
Exactly.
The doctor might prescribe a treatment that's really unpleasant, even painful in the short term.
Right.
But ultimately, it's for the patient's own good.
Precisely. It's about trusting that there's a bigger picture.
A divine wisdom that we can't always see.
Right. And that brings us to another really important part of Ibn Taymiyyah's thought, his idea of perpetual optimism.
Yeah, perpetual optimism. I like the sound of that.
Right. He believed that God's actions, even those that result in suffering, they ultimately serve a wise and beneficial purpose.
So even in the midst of pain and hardship, Ibn Taymiyyah is saying, hey, there's this underlying belief that God is working things out for the best.
Exactly. It's a pretty bold stance.
It is, especially when you consider the very real suffering that people go through.
Absolutely. But it's also incredibly hopeful.
Yeah, it suggests that even in the darkest of times, there's a greater good at work.
Right. Guided by God's infinite wisdom.
It's like saying that God has this cosmic plan, and even though we might not be able to see all the pieces fit together right now, we have to trust that it's leading somewhere good.
That's a great way to put it.
But how do we reconcile that with the idea that God is also just? If he's creating or allowing suffering, how does that square with his justice?
That's where Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding of God's attributes comes in again.
Okay, so remind me what he said about God's attributes.
He said that they're real, but we can't fully comprehend their form or modality.
Okay.
And this applies to his wisdom and justice, too.
We can't box in God's justice with our limited human understanding.
Right. So even when things seem incredibly unfair, or we can't fathom why a just God would allow certain things to happen,
we have to remember that his wisdom and justice operate on a level that's way beyond our comprehension.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the limits of our own perspective.
And trusting in God's infinite wisdom and justice, even when it's hard.
Even when it hurts.
You know, this whole idea of perpetual optimism is really challenging.
It is.
It asks a lot of us, especially when we're confronted with all the suffering and injustice in the world.
But it also offers a glimmer of hope.
It does. It reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles, that God is with us even when it feels like he's distant.
And that his actions, even the ones that bring about pain, are ultimately aimed at bringing about the best possible outcome.
Of course, it's not about being naive or ignoring the very real pain that people experience.
Of course not.
It's more about choosing to approach that pain with a sense of faith and a belief in God's overarching wisdom and goodness.
Beautifully said. It's a profound shift in perspective.
It is. It's about cultivating trust and hope, even in the face of adversity.
And believing that even the most difficult experiences can actually contribute to our growth and development.
It's a powerful idea.